Jimmy Carter was at one time the most well-known Southern Baptist in the world, but he left the denomination in the year 2000, citing their theological views on the role of women as one of his primary reasons for leaving. On this episode of Recollecting Carter, I talk with Dr. Beth Allison Barr, author of The Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth, about the history behind what Carter called a twisted interpretation of the Word of God.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear
the time for racial discrimination is over.
that I will faithfully execute
An undiminished, ever expanding American dream.
the office of President of the United States
The struggle for human rights overrides all differences of color or nation or language.
and will, to the best of my ability,
It is a crisis of confidence.
preserve, protect, and defend
To remove the light of war, the threat of war, would be the overwhelming dream that I've had.
the Constitution of the United States.
We will not learn how to live together in peace by killing each other's children.
So help me God.
I'm Beth Allison Barr, and I'm the James Barteman Professor of History at Baylor University. I think you asked me on to talk a little bit about Southern Baptists and women.
Yeah, to draw on your expertise, certainly you've published in this area. I believe you have some more work coming out in this area and a decent amount of personal experience in the Southern Baptist Convention. Is that right?
I certainly do. I grew up Southern Baptist, and I married a ordained Southern Baptist pastor, and I'm still married to him, too.
Yeah, so Jimmy Carter was at one time arguably the most famous Southern Baptist in the world, and he pretty famously left the denomination in 2000. At that time, it was probably the most high-profile departure. And then several years later, 2009, he wrote an essay called Losing My Religion for Equality. That essay came back into the public mind in 2015 surrounding the lead up to the 2016 election. But that essay starts with the quote, "Women and girls have been discriminated against for too long in a twisted interpretation of the Word of God." For listeners that aren't aware of this history, what is Carter talking about? What's the legacy that led him all the way to the extraordinary step of leaving the denomination and denouncing some of those practices?
I do think you're right. I think until Beth Moore's departure, probably Jimmy Carter's was the biggest about face on the Southern Baptist Convention. And interestingly, they are both at least connected to the treatment of women. And in fact, I would argue that Beth Moore's open letter to our brothers, which if people haven't read that, it's a really phenomenal piece to pair with Jimmy Carter's that he gave in 2009, because I think it shows the aftermath of where SBC theology led and the impact that had, which Carter warned against, on the erosion of the humanity of women, a theology that erodes the humanity of women. So what Carter was talking about in some ways was a portent, I think, in 2000. And for people who don't know what's going on in the Southern Baptist world in 2000, that is when they changed the Baptist faith and message. They amended the part on the family, which I think probably your listeners know that Carter was also connected to conversations about the family. They amended the part on the family to say that women are to graciously submit to the leadership of their husbands. And then also with the 2000 Baptist Faith and Message was a change that had started in 1998. And it was the change that said that only men can be, the pastor elder role is reserved for men. And for folk who were paying attention to the 2024 SBC, they voted by a very narrow margin. They only got 61% voted in the affirmative for a change to the Southern Baptist Constitution, not the Baptist Faith and Message, but the Southern Baptist Constitution, that would have defined that not only are women not to be in lead pastor or elder roles, but they cannot be in any pastor positions at all, which also completely excludes the ordination of women. And that was voted down by a very narrow margin because they needed 2/3 for it to be supported. But at the end of the day, we still ended up with 61% voted that they do not think that Southern Baptist churches should allow women to be in any type of religiously authoritative roles, which is exactly what Carter warned about when he both left in 2000 and then again when he penned those words in 2009.
I'm really interested to hear what is the origin of this kind of thinking. I mean,
Yeah.
you are a medieval history scholar, so we may have to go way back
Yeah.
to find these origins to help us understand, in a time where even in the faith space, so many institutions are becoming more progressive for the Southern Baptist Convention to be actively going in what many would view as a backwards direction.
Yes.
Seems odd. So what's the historical context that we need to know to understand?
Does seem odd, doesn't it? It seems odd and scary and bewildering in so many different ways. And so for those who don't know, I wrote a book in 2021, which I'm actually only now beginning to really understand the quagmire that I threw myself into. And that book was called The Making of Biblical Womanhood: How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth. And in it, I argued that the modern roots of evangelical gender theology that argues that women are equal to men, but are divined by God to be in a subordinate role. I argue that that gender theology is not actually rooted in the Bible, which is what is claimed, nor is it rooted in church history, but it is rooted simply in broader misogyny and sexism, which, it's just thanks to the Barbie movie, we can all call patriarchy easily and people understand what that means. But that was the argument that I made in that book, walking through both the Bible as well as church history up into the modern era, showing where these ideas about women being divinely called to be in subordinate roles to men, which is connected to women's role as wives. And I think that's really the clincher that we see. If we want to talk about the origin of this SBC theology about women, it is born in the Protestant Reformation. And what the Protestant Reformation did that I think historians are still arguing about, because it's just absolutely fascinating. But what it did is it elevated the role of wives. In the medieval world, the highest thing that both a woman and man could do was to forsake marriage and sexual relationships and give themselves up to devoted service to God and the church and to praying and pastoral care, which was separate from being married. And this was the same calling for both women and men in the medieval church. And even though in medieval Christianity, women mostly could not be in religiously authoritative roles, I always call it there's a loophole in medieval Christianity because of this emphasis on giving up one's sexual desires. Both women and men can give up their sexual desires, which puts women on more of an equal playing field to men, and also allows women to have a religiously authoritative voice in the medieval world in a way that is not possible any longer in conservative evangelical traditions like the Southern Baptist Convention. The Protestant Reformation, what it did is it flipped this. It said now the most important thing both a woman and a man can do is to get married and to have children and to form what they envisioned as the godly household. And this godly household was also part of a growing change in legal and nation-state theory. The idea is that a godly household that is ruled by a godly man mimics the godly state, which is ruled by a godly king. And the rise of divine right theory of, if you think about what happens in France and even in England with King James, et cetera, with this emphasis on the divine right of kings. So again, as I said, this emphasis on what women should be in the church is echoing these non-religious arguments about legal and nation and the growth of the nation state. And what it is doing, though, it is reducing women legally to their identity is now an appendage of their husbands. That's how women are defined, by who their husbands are and who their fathers are, etc. And their legal identity is reduced to that of children. So by the time we get to the 19th century, which is just a horrific century for women, I just, put it out there. It's a horrific century for women. And what we find in the Western world is that women, when they get married, they completely lose their personhood separate from that of their husbands. And they can't even defend themselves in court. They have no ownership over their property. They don't even have parental rights over their kids. Legally, their kids belong to their husbands. So if they left their husband for any reason, they'd lose their kids. And with this too, this is also when we begin to see a big emphasis on why do women have to put up with this? Because the Bible says so. And we see this with these modern English Bible translations, reducing women's personhood to subjugation to men. Very broad picture. I just covered up 500 years for you in history. But what the SBC is doing now is rooted in this fundamental change that happened in the post-Reformation world.
If you tie it into the Protestant Reformation, my first thought is this is then tied so deeply into the formation of America and how we think of ourselves and what's come to be known as American exceptionalism.
Yes.
So, these ideas are really strong. They're really baked into our national identity and culture. But I am interested to know why you think they are seeing a resurgence in some quarters now.
Yeah.
Right? Like, is it fair to think of gender relations in American history as similar in many ways to race, where there are gains and then those gains are lost and it's an ebb and a flow? Because often I feel like the history that we hear in school is more of a straight line and things got steadily better.
No. Yeah. No, this idea of linear progressivism, I call it, when I teach it in my class, I call it the Star Trek theory. This idea that I'm a Star Trek fan, I'm a sci-fi fan. But this idea in Star Trek is that the world just keeps getting better and better and better. And that they, now have gone to this idealistic society where everyone's equal and there's no money and no capitalism and everything like that. This is definitely an idea that was born in the scientific revolution, as well as what we call the Enlightenment, although I don't actually like that term, but nonetheless, that we call it that period. And this idea that humanity is just progressing forward and getting better and better and better. And that this also includes, I think this came with a lot of the mythologies about the medieval and the ancient world, where people are like, well, gosh, women in Christianity have it so much better than Jewish women because Christianity is progressive, whereas Judaism is not progressive. And that's totally untrue. The reason that we see women playing such formative roles in the Bible is because women played formative roles in Judaism. And women could be, we know synagogue leaders, et cetera. And so what a better understanding of it, although I'm still careful with this as a historian, is that when we see gains made by particular people, we often see a reinforcement of trying to go back to when they did not have those gains. And it's kind of a cycle. I will also say history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And I think that's a much better, I forget who said that, but whoever said that, that's a much better description. So what I think we see now is history rhyming.
So talk about some of the gains. If we're right now, at least in some quarters of American life, in a cycle of losing ground, what are some of the gains that are being reclaimed against those?
That's really a great question. So for people who don't know much about me, I am a medieval historian, but I'm a medieval women's historian. My expertise focuses on church history and also women's movements. And so one of the other courses I teach at Baylor, which has become quickly one of my favorite courses, it's one of our freshman introductory courses, and I teach it on Votes for Women. Essentially, it's a comparative course that focuses on comparing the U.S. and the U.K., as well as taking it globally. And I have learned so much. I can answer this question a lot better now because of how I've been teaching this course for several semesters now. And one of the things that always astounds my students is to learn that it wasn't until the 1970s that women start getting things like the ability to take out credit in their own name and not have to have male co-signers to be able to purchase a home or to purchase a car without having to have male cosigners or to have those loans denied primarily because of their sex. It's during this time that women start to see some of the barriers come down for them to have full education access as men, like in law schools and in graduate education, and to be able to get the same type of, that there's not going to be gender discrimination for them when they apply for those types of schools. Also, you think about gender in the workplace, and it is not until the 60s and the 70s that there begins to be a great deal of awareness of how much discrimination women face. For one, women could and were routinely fired when they got married because there was this understanding that if you get married, that's now your job and you can't hold another job outside. And then there was also fears about pregnancy. People are like, why in the world do we live in a place where women don't have access to maternity leave? My university, Baylor University, which is a Christian university, when I had both my kids in 2004 and 2010, there was no maternity leave. There was no way for me to take off to have my children. And so we wonder why that. And it's like, well, until the 60s and the 70s, women could be fired for being pregnant. Businesses were not able to build in the mechanisms that allowed women to be able to pursue their callings. If you think about what I said about the Protestant Reformation, we had crystallized this idea that a woman's job is to be a wife, and that this is something that is both something that God designs as well as the Western culture defines. A woman's job is to be a wife and to be a mother. And this became codified into the business practices of the US. It's not until the 60s and 70s, and really it's an aftermath of World War II, when women were so integral to helping the US and the Western world be successful in World War II, that they no longer could ignore allowing women, those old arguments that women don't have the brains to be able to do this, that they can't do the work. One of my favorite movies is the movie Hidden Figures with the Black women in NASA. And it's just such a wonderful story because it breaks down all these barriers about what women can do. And it's not until the 60s and 70s that we begin to see these barriers breaking down legally and structurally within our society. It's also when we see that, along with women now being able to become lawyers and be able to become doctors and be able to become university professors, women also start moving into seminaries. And it's in the 1970s that we see this huge influx of women into seminaries, including the 6 flagship SBC seminaries. In fact, the estimates are as high as, 6,000-ish women are moving into these seminaries, pursuing degrees that are in pastoral and in professional ministry. And so suddenly, I think there is this fear. It's like if all of these women move through and get ordained, suddenly we have all these women who are competing with men for these types of pastoral jobs that traditionally only men have held. I would argue not actually because of the Bible, but simply because of our social structures that made it much easier for men to get the schooling and to have the job connections to get these jobs over women.
So many of those gains that you mentioned came during the Carter years. Carter was considered a very progressive president on gender at the time, and certainly he and Rosalind have been true partners, especially they've considered themselves missionaries. They call themselves missionaries in his post-presidential work. With Carter's departure from the SBC in 2000 at the turn of the millennium and other high-profile departures, you mentioned Beth Moore. There's also Dr. Russell Moore. Figures like that, how are they remembered in the SBC right now? Are they talked about? Are they remembered poorly? Or do we just try to forget about them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So Jimmy Carter, I think, is an example of how the SBC remembers some of these figures. And Jimmy Carter has been pretty much written out as not representing SBC ideals, as being a non-evangelical. He's not one of us. I think that's what Kristen Dumais writes about evangelical attitudes towards Jimmy Carter, is he's not one of us. I think with Beth Moore, before I even imagined ever doing anything like what I do now, I remember in many of the churches I was in, there was a great deal of hesitancy towards using Beth Moore's books because she was a woman teaching. I understand better now some of the things that were said about her that were completely untrue, but it was people trying to undermine her credentials to be able to be a Bible study teacher. And so I think in the SBC, what we see is those types of attitudes just are continuing. Like the ground had already been laid. She was a problematic person from the very beginning because she was clearly I hate to put words in her mouth. I'm just thinking historically, looking back, I see Beth Moore as a preacher, and she's a pastoral figure. Her ministry that she has established and built up for women is all about pastoral care and teaching women, being a pastor through this very large online network. And her authority that she carries over these women who look to her for advice and read her books and take that type of spiritual direction is, I think at the last on Twitter, she had like around 1 million Twitter followers. And I can't even put into numbers how many people follow her and read her stuff and in many ways see her as a pastor. Far surpasses any even megachurch person in the SBC. And so she is still a real problem for them. The only way that you can combat that type of a problem is to try to discredit them and then to try to say that they're not really evangelical. I mean, you can even think about, for me, for those who don't know, just go read, although I hate to direct people to the Gospel Coalition and to Desiring God and to the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, but go read their reviews of me. I mean, it is crazy, the things that they have accused me of. I think one of their when I stopped reading anything they said was when they essentially accused me of being a bad mother, which was such a trope. That was where I was just like, this is all they can do to go after me, is to try to discredit me in a way that would make sense within this narrow evangelical idea that only values women through their relationship to a man and through a wife and a mother. So the way they discredit my scholarship is by discrediting me as a mother. So I think these tropes continue. And I think that canceling of Jimmy Carter is what we are going to continue to see with all of these figures who are threatening. And in fact, I'm one of these. I'm a former SBC woman who speaks out against the SBC, and the cancel culture is really strong, trying to write me out so that people don't listen.
As someone who has extensively studied a very long history of cycles of these kinds of things, is there any reason to be hopeful for how the memory of figures might change over time? Once we kind of get through this, whether the SBC finds a way through this or whether they fade into obscurity, how do you think the memory of figures like Carter and Beth Moore that spoke out, how will they be remembered?
This is the beauty of the age in which we live. I think one of the problems, this is something women's historians talk about all the time, is we're always having to reinvent the wheel because we lose that memory. But because of social media, because of the internet, because of the easy connections that are made, women are suddenly realizing that women have always stood against patriarchy and that women's voices have always shouted down 1 Timothy 2:11 through 14, that women have always spoken against these types of things. And now these voices that were long forgotten, people now have ready access to. And so Beth Moore is not going away. Jimmy Carter is now, even your podcast, I think, shows this resurgence of attitudes. And people are like, wait a minute, Jimmy Carter was saying this in the 70s? It's not just historians who are in the archives who have access to this material. Podcasts are magnificent in getting information out there, that as long as they're reputable podcasts, that you can actually connect them to the primary sources, but they are changing the game of memory, of cultural memory. And so that gives me hope every single day, because you cannot silence these voices from the past anymore. So I think the SBC is fighting a losing battle.
Well, thank you so much for coming on this podcast. I really appreciate you sharing and taking the time. Recollecting Carter is produced by me, Jason Lee Guthrie, with support from Georgia Humanities and the Liebner Cooper Family Foundation. Original music and sound design by Joel Corey. Logo design by Whitney Matheson. Archival media provided by the Carter Center. Special thanks to my intern Michael Smith and my students at Clayton State University who have contributed to this podcast. You can connect with the show online at recollectingcarter.com.